wait, my God, upon your instruction. Your dear themes, my God, as only you can exposit them. So be with us, my God, and as you were with your disciples of old, and communicating to them and to us, Lord, the things that are dear to your own heart and important for our understanding in this particular historic moment and all that lies before. Bless this time, my God. Make it utterly significant. You know us. We're always asking that you'll make it historic. And how often, if not always, you answer in that way. So bless this now, Lord, and be with your own word. Open it, Lord, that it might be made fruitful and engrafted, consequential for time and eternity. We thank and give you praise in Yeshua's name. Amen. Well, you can turn to Luke chapter 15. We're going to take a little fleeting look at the parable of the two sons, the prodigal son and his resentful brother. But let me read this to you while you're turning. Maybe it's like a summation or a summary of a whole perspective that the Lord is giving us to communicate. The people Israel, whose theocratic Davidic kingdom it is, must be made consonant with that kingdom. To administer it in the distinctive character of the king, obtained only in a national resurrection from the dead, they must pass like Jesus before them, the patterned son, through a road to Calvary, a highway of holiness, and later through the very Gentile nations that reject them, so as to dispense mercy through grace and humility, as the priestly nation that overcomes evil with good and judgment with mercy, so revealing the God of Jacob, that all nations might praise and honor him as Lord over all. This everlasting exaltation as the head of all nations is obtained out of a final abasement and humiliation, the time of Jacob's trouble, by which transgressors and rebels are purged out, and a remnant purged and purified to become the redeemed of the Lord returned to Zion. That redeemed Israel, saved out of death, are the eternal beneficiaries of an essentially Gentile church who travailed for its birth, cherished its rubble and stones, and had pity for its dust, in full identification with the nation in its chastisement and judgment. We're going to be speaking about that today. The key by which deliverance comes to them out of Zion. The present state of Israel is the preliminary and matrix out of which the millennial nation comes, having had final opportunity to contrast the land given as an inheritance and maintained in covenant righteousness, itself a gift, and Jerusalem the city of peace, from the bloodshed, violence, and corruption that inevitably issues out of autonomous and proud men, of which we Jews are the epitome. Our very changed nature is itself a standard raised up before all nations, and a light to which they can come out of the thick gloom and darkness which presently covers the earth. Not bad. What a summary on this card of the whole mystery of Israel and the church, of which Paul said, I would not have you to be ignorant, lest you become wise in your own conceit. It's one of the few or only mysteries I know that the ignorance of which carries a supreme penalty. And I would say that that penalty is visibly evident today in the church. The church is conceited, inflated, pompous, because the one thing that would have tempered it and brought a note of humility into its character and given it an understanding of the perspective of God has been lost to it because it doesn't know the mystery. It's this mystery that is so utterly profound in revealing the very God himself. And it's the final and last days mystery. There's nothing that follows this. This is the end, is the mystery of Israel and the church. The reciprocity between these two bodies. The church is so ignorant that it can't even understand itself or come into its own identity or the fullness of its own call and purpose, the realization of God for it, independent of and separated from the people Israel. And it's a people that we would not have chosen as a Gentile church. They would have been for us instinctively and historically undesirable. And how about Israel toward the church? Equally. If there's anything that's anathema for Jews, it's the church. They can't bear even to pass under the shadow of the spire and the cross that might fall upon them in walking on the street. I don't care what polite external air they might communicate. There's a deep Jewish enmity against the church, against Christ. And ironically, the very thing calculated for their salvation is the thing that is most offensive. Why is that? Satan has seen to it. That there is only one name given whereby a man might be saved, but that name has been so polluted and corrupted for Jews that they can barely speak it, except as an irritation or even a curse word. How many times I said Jesus Christ as an unbeliever, like spitting something out, but never able to call upon that name reverently. Because history has so affected the way in which we Jews even perceive the name. We have been persecuted in that name. We've been stretched at the rack, burned at the stake, forced conversions, a threat of violence or death, mass suicides. It's not unusual in the history of Israel, particularly in Europe, through the Middle Ages, when their doors were being battered down by the crusading knights on the ways to the Holy Land, or an enraged mob in the Passover Easter season calling for the conversion of Jews or their death, that Jews preferred death. Can you imagine a father slitting the throat of his own children and that of his wife and then of himself? That when the doors finally burst down and they came rushing in, they found the sea of dead swamped in their own blood. And this is called Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying the name of the Lord by taking your own life rather than becoming a Christian. The cards are stacked against us. History has conspired against the fulfillment of this mystery, that the one people appointed to be the provision of God for Israel's redemption is the church. And yet the church has become so horrific and distasteful to the people who would most be benefited by it. And then, what shall we say of the enmity that is natural and organic between Gentiles and Jews? Even if they were not this history, there's something in the composition of what we are as Jews and Gentiles that is antithetical one to the other. Let's not get democratic and say, no, there's no distinction between Jews and Gentiles. Baloney! You have only to be a Jew and be married to a Gentile to know how great those distinctions are. We can't even identify them, but they're very real. It's just the Lord has made it that way, so that in the mystery of God, that which in the natural would most militate against any kind of resolution or reconciliation is the very thing that God is seeking to obtain, and can only be obtained by His power. He has so set the situation that there'll be no resolution of it except through the manifestation of Himself. This mystery cannot be humanly resolved, fulfilled, or established. It requires the utter and final supreme demonstration of God as God. And by that demonstration, He will be glorified before the face of all nations. He's not going to do this in a corner, but before the face of all nations. So the stink of Israel is already becoming an international scandal. And it will get worse as it goes on. Those who had sentimental affection for Israel, or were excited about the prospect of the state of Israel being born, and had hope that it would exhibit to the world what a Jewish nation is, are increasingly and daily becoming disappointed. And it will worsen and worsen. It'll come to such a point that those who were the most animated in their identification and support of Israel may well be the first ones to turn in complete disgust and contempt for a nation that has failed them and disappointed them in their expectations. And in that way, God will reveal the shabbiness of shallow, sentimental affinity as against that relationship that God calls the church to have with Israel, that cannot be disappointed because it's not enacted at the level of human enthusiasm or idealism or sentiment, but at the level of the heart of God Himself, the unconditional love of God. So for the church to fulfill its role and its destiny, it itself has got to come into a place in the knowledge of God that it would not otherwise have sought nor obtained, except that the crisis of Israel has demanded it. And in that way, when the smoke clears at the end, God has a redeemed nation and a transfigured church, both of them now prepared for their eternal mandate, for their millennial commission to the nations. Got the picture?
Yeah.
Class dismissed.
I know. We can ponder that all day, brother.
What a scheme. What a
mouthful.
Yeah. Okay. So we need to see a few texts that will illumine these thoughts. And we're all familiar with the parable of the prodigal son and his brother. And Jesus gave it and spoke that there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the young son gathered all that he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. I just can't help but interrupt myself. What a coincidence of the timing of that famine. If it's more than coincidence, and it's God's timing, and even God's provision, that he did not think it too extravagant to bring a famine in the land for the sake of one son, that famine would set in motion the distress that would bring him to a place before his own Father and God that would not otherwise have been obtained, raises the question, how far will God go for the perfecting and the establishment of a son? It's not too much for him to bring distress to nations, even to upset the world in the bringing forth of the fulfillment of his will for one. Isn't that remarkable? Mm-hmm. Of course, if it's a coincidence, then the whole point is lost. But if God is sovereign, and famines that come upon nations are not coincidental, but part of the divine stratagem and provision, then it ought to give us pause. How far will God go in the perfection of a son? How far has he already gone with us? How far will he yet go? And those things that we have dismissed as seemingly coincidental or circumstantial were really the sovereignty of God, divinely ordained. It's staggering. No wonder we have so little appreciation for the love of God, because we have missed how explicit he has been in his dealing and shaping of us, which we thought was merely circumstantial, but it's really the sovereign and explicit will of God being performed, which is the love of God. Though it's a distress, it's such a love that it will not shrink from bringing distress. See how mamby-pamby we are? We think love means making nice. Well, that's the difference between the false prophets and the true. The false prophets want to make nice. They want to speak a word of peace, even when there is no peace. They heal the wounds or the sickness of my daughter lightly, Jeremiah says of the false prophets. They want to make nice. They're condescending. A pat on the back, a cheap, full gospel bear hug, or in the foyer of the church, "Hi, brother," who's not a brother. You know what I mean? That's the shallow level at which most of the church is living its life. No wonder it doesn't know God. It's a puff. It's a vapor. And they call that love. Love is willing to inflict. Love will not shrink from the pain necessary for ultimate redemptive ends. Nor will it interfere with the operation of God toward those ends by getting in the way to make nice or to bring a premature word of comfort which will actually upset or offset the redemptive work of God through the trial that he's bringing. My heart goes out to Christian wives living with either backslidden or unsaved husbands who have to suffer them in that pitiful and wretched condition in which they themselves are the victim, and fear even for the safety of their own children as these men work out with anger, vexation, and violence the contradictions of their own life, and want so much to intervene, and if they can only do something, to leave scriptures around in the bathroom and on the toilet and hope that he'll pick this up. Or, They want an end to their distress. They want to see this guy saved already. Because when he does get saved, they have to run to keep up with him. And they almost prefer him in his previous condition than his present condition. But to watch a man die by inches before you and foam in frustration and discontent as the contradictions of his life bring him to a final paroxysm is something. Love will bear that. Love will not seek to ease him of his distress. It will want to see the distress worked through unto a real salvation. And not the least of that, what love has to bear is not only the pain of that, but the reproach that will come from others who will accuse you, ironically, of lovelessness. Because shouldn't you be doing something? Hey, listen, your wife is suffering. Your husband, shouldn't you alleviate? Shouldn't you make nice? Shouldn't you comfort? Not if that is going to get in the way of the redemptive working of God, which is necessarily painful. It's a suffering before a glory. How come we don't know that? Because we have fallen short of the knowledge that would have been communicated to us through the appropriation of the cross. Once we had surrendered to that and understood that, not only as the experience of Jesus, but the pivotal and classic paradigm for all reality, then we would see its outworking in those who are close by us, and we would not resist it. We would understand necessarily that there's a suffering that precedes a glory. We would not hope for anything premature. We would not be satisfied with an improvement or a progressive amelioration. We're waiting for the glory. We're apostolic. We're jealous for the glory. Unto him be glory in the church. Not satisfaction, not alleviation. Got the idea? And there's no issue for us at the church, in our generation, this last hour, that more tests us on this issue than the subject of Israel itself. Our greatest adversaries who are out for our lives, who hate our guts, are those who are endorsing and believing in the present state of Israel as somehow being the hope for fulfillment in prophecy, and read the scriptures in such a way as to endorse their view. And have very scant patience for anyone who says, no, the present Israel is only the preliminary. It only was given by God to set in motion the crisis out of which the suffering and dispersal and the violence and last days apocalyptic judgment that must take place and have its inception in Israel. Then will the end come. Then will there be a restored nation that will glorify God. So you see the friction between those who want to make nice and want to endorse the present thing and hope for its progressive amelioration, that means improvement, as against those who are holding still, like Jesus, when he was told that his friend Lazarus was sick, remained 2 days longer where he was, sufficient for Lazarus to die. What kind of a friend is that? Who raised the dead of strangers and healed the sick of people who didn't know, and doesn't rush to the bedside of his own friend, of which the scripture says, whom he loved? What kind of love is that? It's the love of God. That's what kind of love that is. That doesn't want to put a band-aid on something or a quickie, but knows that this suffering is not unto death, but for the glory of God and for his Son. He waited for Lazarus to die. And meanwhile, what did his disciples think? This guy's cowardly. This master and teacher, he's beginning to show something now that, we need to pray for him. He's afraid to go to Bethany because it's only a stone's throw from Jerusalem, where his life has been threatened. So he's saving his own skin. His skin and his own survival and the preservation of his own life is more important than succoring his friend on a sickbed unto death. Shows his true colors. They never said that, but I'll bet you dollars to donuts they thought it. How else would they interpret a man who delays from bringing a relief that he's so readily able to bring? Why is he delaying? It must be the fear of his own skin, because they're projecting on him what would have been their own rationale. See what I mean? And Jesus was willing to suffer that misunderstanding and that reproach. Fidelity to God, particularly in a patience for suffering without interfering, is an ultimate test of sainthood. In fact, I would say it's the test of sonship. And had he not done that, had he gone prematurely and acted out of his human impulse to bring relief, which would have blessed everyone, when the day would have come for him to stand outside that tomb and cry, Lazarus, come forth, you know what would have come forth? A dull thud. Zero, zilch, nothing. The only reason Lazarus came forth is because God the Father honored the prophetic obedience of his Son, who waited until death. And the issue of Israel is exactly that issue. Those who are running now to bring comfort. Well, doesn't it say, comfort ye, my people? Yes, it says that. But when? After they have suffered double for their sins. Premature comfort is from the pit. So, that's why I'm at war with sentimentality. I despise sentimentality. It's the last refuge of man. And he gets away with it because it has an outward appearance of good. Who doesn't want schmaltzy sentimentality and benevolence and nice things and things that feel good? And therefore it disguises the evil root of it. Man wanting recognition, wanting alleviation from distress, and ignoring the issue of those things that pertain to the glory of God. It's as vile and as evil and as wicked as anything that can issue from the pit. But men get away with it because it has the appearance of good. Only a son, a discerning son, and a prophet knows the difference and will be obedient not to interfere and not to alleviate, knowing that the issue is not recovery of a man from his distress or a nation from its distress, but that the issue is a nation restored or brought forth out of that death unto resurrection and glory forever. The greatest impediment to the love of God is human sentiment. Nothing more obtrudes upon and displaces the divine working and the expression of the love of God than human sentiment. We have got to die to the one in order to be available to the other. And it's a no man's land between the death of the one and the attainment of the other. It's not going to come in with a rush and all of a sudden you're going to abound in divine love because you have brought sentiment unto death. Likely will be tested and there'll be nothing to have replaced sentiment but your face sticking out without an excuse, and you'll appear to be the most loveless, hard, indifferent, and all the other kinds of things that men will be quick to note and to say. That's part of the death. The bearing of the reproach of that is part of the death. So the issue, as is every issue in the last analysis, is the issue of the cross. And so I'm saying again that with the crisis of Israel in the last days, the church is going to be tested on its response. And it may well be that the true church from the false, the apostate from the apostolic, will be decided on this question. And that men will kill us and claim they're doing God a service because we're opposed to the purposes of God for Israel, and will even be accused of being anti-Semitic by those who want to rush in and to alleviate distress and bring an immediate answer that is not God's. I'm called that now. I'm Jewish and I'm called an anti-Semite. I'm called an enemy of Israel and giving aid to her enemies by saying that there's a future for Israel that's apocalyptic in devastation, judgment, and suffering, and that cannot be averted by your prayer. And that if your prayer for Israel and the peace of Jerusalem is shabby and sentimental, it's not only valueless, it even opposes the truth of God and the work of God. So shallow saints who thought they were doing God's service because they mumble a prayer once in a while or even every day, Lord, I pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and are relieved of their responsibility.
What is an anti-Semite?
Anti means against. Semite are Jews, Semitic people. That phrase has come up in modern times. That's the label. It's Jew hatred. Hatred against the Jew, which is, by the way, burgeoning in Russia and in many places of the world today. And watch it, even in your own local communities, where graffiti is being written on synagogue walls, tombstones are being knocked over in their cemeteries, and violence being affected even in their halls. The Jewish community is panicking at the increase of the rise of anti-Semitic incidents in parts of the world that have always been a haven of safety. And interesting to note that many of these places where anti-Semitism is becoming increasingly rife are university and college campuses, where you would think enlightened men. No. There you have pockets of Nazis who think that they're doing mankind service by ridding it of this blight on mankind which they perceive the Jews to be. One of the great slogans of Nazi Germany, Die Juden sind unser, the Jews are our Unglück, misfortune. That, in these big Nazi rallies, they would have this banner all around the auditorium, thousands of people, the Jews are our misfortune. They're accursed people. And wherever they are, they're going to be insidious and penetrate your economy and bring it down. They have Zionist conspiracy. They want to take over the world. You know, even this thought of Jews taking over the world, the famous anti-Semitic heresy, the piece of literature, what is it called? The Protocols of Zion. Are you guys hearing about this for the first time? Oh my goodness. Elementary, my dear Watson. But something you should understand. There's a history of anti-Semitism. And isn't it interesting that the guy who shot up those kids in Los Angeles calls himself a Christian? And he comes out of some kind of white church, racial, worldwide church of something. And Jews have to read church, the word church, with murder, and say, here we go again. It's the old story being enacted again. So, Protocols of Zion is a supposed piece of literature that was written by Jews in which they express their plan to take over the world through financial manipulation. Because look, they're in these key places of the economy. They're like a fraction of 1% of the population, but look at their prominence in the government and economy and finance and trade and commerce, and they're in influential places. Look at the men who have affected the 20th century. Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and Albert Einstein, all Jews. German-speaking Jews, which is not an incidental thing. We need to know these things because everything, every factor of history and nature will lend itself to this increasing bitterness against Jews that will one day erupt, even in this country as it did in Nazi Germany. What do you think we're immune? Because we're Americans, apple pie and mother, and that will insulate us from this poison, this anti-Semitic spirit that comes out of the pit of hell? No way. We will collapse more quickly in America than Germany did, because they had Goethe, Schiller, Fichte, Hegel, Nietzsche, and Kant, and Schopenhauer, and Beethoven, and Mozart. They had a culture that was so deep, and yet it went down like the proverbial deck of cards. What have we got? Babe Ruth and who's the guy who hit 70 home runs, and Elvis Presley. Man, we're a cream puff. We go down like that. Unless we have a spirit in us, greater and other than the spirit of racial and religious hatred that will envelop and fill every vacuum that it can find in an unregenerate mankind, despite their culture. Got the picture? We're in for something. How is it that Jews are going to be forced through nations and be expelled and be in exile and not have a shirt on their back? That Matthew 25 is the foundation of the final judgment of Gentiles by Jesus when he takes his place as king. His one question in separating the sheep from the goats is, what have you done for the least of these my brethren? Lord, we didn't even know that they were your brethren. They passed right through our communities, but they were only despicable Jews who were unsaved and unregenerate and got what they deserved. See what I mean? Our attitude, how we view them, what we recognize in them, and how we extend mercy to them is the determining factor of whether we inherit a kingdom prepared for us or whether we're cast into the lake of fire prepared for the devil and his angels. What radical alternatives of an eternal kind on the basis of one thing only? Is that fair? But Lord, I did this, I did that, I was a nice guy, I attended services, I went to Ben Israel. Only one question. What did you do for the least of these, my brethren? Because that one question is every question. It subsumes everything. Your willingness to extend mercy at a time when it would threaten your own life and peril your family. Because who's going to aid Jews in Germany when they're not allowed to sit in parks or to buy or to sell? That if a grocery store on the corner sold a quart of milk to a Jew, he's putting his head on the block. His business could be confiscated. He could find himself in a concentration camp for aiding a Jew. If you think that was a one-time moment in history that will never come again, you have another think coming. That was the dress rehearsal for something that will now become universal in every nation over this issue of regard to this people who are interestingly proliferated in every nation. Show me a country in which they are not. I found them in Japan, in the Philippines. It doesn't matter. They're everywhere because it's the working out of God's testing of the nations and of the church of the nations through their very presence. And if they are not presently in that nation, they'll be passing through that nation in flight from anti-Semitic persecution in the last days, called the time of Jacob's trouble. Okay. All of that sparked by this one thing of a famine that came and will come. It raises the question not only about us, but about God. That He's willing to allow a famine merely for the perfecting of one Son? Yes, but that one Son is the key of the ages. That one Son is God's intention for the redemption of nations. If that Son will become a Son indeed. If He'll be saved out of his profligate lifestyle and be brought into the service of the Father, that's the Father's key for all nations. Do you realize that? Because Israel has a commission that God has never forgotten. A nation of priests and a light unto the world. A promise made to Father Abraham that from your loins will come a people who will bless all the families of the earth. Are you being blessed by the son of Abraham? I mean, I'm no big hot shot, but this is only a faint presentiment of the kind of blessing that will come out of a people who are brought into priestliness from out of commerce and Wall Street and buying and selling and all the kinds of things to which Jews have given themselves, different from and other than their call to be a light unto the nations. Got the picture? The priest shall teach the people the difference between the sacred and the profane. Well, our world is steeped in profanity. I'm not talking about filthy, vulgar language. The whole world is obscene. Its vulgarity and its low morals and its condition has become so commonplace that we don't even look up. This is standard operating procedure. It's vulgar, it's coarse, it's violent, it's deranged. That's the way the world is. Why? Because there's an absence in its midst of a people who alone are qualified and given by God to be a light to the nations. You remember that of the 12 tribes of Israel, one was a priestly tribe, the Levites, from whom I am personally descended. And their function had nothing to do with commerce, trade, agriculture. They lived from the Lord. He was their inheritance. And their function was to infiltrate, so to speak, and to bring the benevolence of God. They were the teachers of the Word of God. They taught the law. They were the example. They were the separated people to influence the other 11 tribes, or Israel would not be Israel. You see what we have in a microcosm? That the Levitical tribe, with regard to the benevolence given to the rest of Israel, is the same principle as the nation of Israel redeemed and given to the nations. We are a people for the nations. How far will God go in the perfecting of that nation for the nations? He'll go to this degree. But those of us who don't understand what's at stake here, millennially and eternally, and the whole redemptive saga of God for the nations and for His creation, might find ourselves disposed to accuse God as being cruel, unkind, unjust. Haven't they suffered enough already? Didn't they go through a Holocaust 50 years ago? That they should go through another one within the same century that eclipses the first in its magnitude? Where's God? No wonder that Paul says that the age will conclude with a falling away. There'll be a great apostasy. and a falling away out of disappointment about God, who is not fulfilling the scenario as we thought that he ought. Israel should be established, the church should be raptured. When those things fail to happen, disillusion and disappointment might eventuate in rejection. One woman said to me, if there's no rapture, she said, why am I even bothering to be a Christian? The only reason I'm a Christian, she said, is I want a ticket out of here. I don't know if it's the same woman, but it could have been, who said about Israel, who disliked my view of Israel's necessary suffering, coming judgment. But she said that we need Israel because the church is so dry, so gray. We need the scintillation that comes with the excitement of being identified with the people who performed the Entebbe crisis. Okay. We love a people who are full of human exploits. Because the church is so dull and listless, we like the romantic image of the present-day Israeli. And if that is scheduled for judgment and destruction, then what about us? We're left holding the bag. See how cheap and selfish are the motives of carnal Christians, both toward God and toward Israel, as it pertains only to their own satisfaction in being. The complaint that I've heard most frequently from men in ministry in Israel about my suggestion of a coming devastation in the land and likely expulsion from the land is, but Art, what about my ministry? You can't be right because my ministry is in the land. So how can God bring judgment? Because my ministry is there and my ministry has got to continue. After all, my ministry is in fact the key to Israel's salvation. See what I mean? Okay. So it may be that great numbers of Christians who think they're doing God's service and Israel's service are actually praying against the will of God for Israel. Mm-hmm. Lord, remove the PLO. Lord, remove Arafat. Lord, when that may be God's very instrumentality. The rod of chastisement will come through an outraged Palestinian people in the Arab nations. They're not to be removed. They're to be employed. God even calls them my servants, that are consecrated to do my will. Of course, they don't know that. So then the question comes up, how then shall a saint pray? We thought we were praying rightly. How then shall we pray, Art? I said, isn't it interesting? You're brought to a new crisis about your own spiritual life and your own prayer. You can no longer pray from your natural understanding because that will inevitably bring you in opposition to the purposes and will of God itself. How then shall we pray? There's only one way, maybe ever and always, by the Spirit. So there's a new premium, even for charismatics and Pentecostals, to relate to God and to pray out of what God Himself gives through the Spirit. And this is something unknown even to those who ostensibly celebrate the Spirit. Those that are led by the Spirit of God, these are the sons of God. We have quoted that, but we've not done that. It's a very sensitive business and requires such an affinity with God so as to pick up the valence and disposition of His Spirit. I'm not a man who cries often, but the one time I remember where I was so done in, I fell under the table at a full gospel breakfast meeting when a speaker who has now gone on to be with the Lord said, in my earlier Christian life, he said, I was careful to be sure to obey the commandments of God. But as I have gone on, he said, I now wait to fulfill the intimation of His Spirit. I anticipate and sense the disposition of His Spirit. And that's what I fulfill. Because commandments, who cannot fulfill a commandment? What are you going to do, disobey it? The real issue of sonship is not commandment, but the intimation of the will of God, the disposition of His heart to sense it and feel it, to intuit it, and to obey it. And I can tell you that the heaviest times of responsibility for me in the last 30 years have been exactly on that basis. It's easy to obey God when He said in a big arena at the University of Chicago some years ago, preach the cross. But I don't always get that. In fact, as I go on, there is less explicit command and more intimation of His will, intuited, by the proximity that we have with his own heart. And on that gossamer basis, we're called to obedience when everything else seems to be contrary to what you are intuiting is the need and what ought to be spoken and performed. This is like walking a tight wire. And one misstep is not only you going down, but bringing everything down with you. That's why Paul cries out, who is sufficient for these things? I don't know of anyone in Christendom, in contemporary Christianity, who has done more disservice to the Spirit of God than those who ostensibly celebrate it, namely charismatics and Pentecostals. They are the coarsest, most obdurate, insensitive, loud practitioners celebrating the Spirit of God while they are missing it or missing Him. Because there's a sensitivity, a disposition, an affinity, a union with God to catch the inflection of His heart. He's a still, small voice. And perhaps we will have graduated into sonship when He's no longer required even to exercise His voice. But that there are people who don't need to wait for His commandments that He speaks, but pick up His very disposition and intuition. Okay, how should we pray for Israel? And not find ourselves in opposition to God's very plan for it, only in the realm of spirit. And here's the catch. We're not talking about individual virtuoso prayer, but we're talking about the most powerful form of prayer, which is corporate. How do we find the mind of the Lord corporately and pray that? And that brings us into a whole issue of the church, its composition, relationship, of what the church itself is. Can you see just by this conversation? We would never even be in this discussion, except for the crisis or the issue that Israel raises. Not in her success, but in her failure. It's Israel's failure, it's Israel's apostasy, it's Israel's backsliddenness that presents for the church the crises and issues that compel us to be the church as nothing else would have. Oh, the depth of the riches, Paul cries out in Romans 11, of the wisdom and the knowledge of God, who has been his counselor. What is Paul celebrating? What has he seen? That he can't even contain himself. Prose can't express the depth of this doxology that he ends his great dissertation, chapters 9 to 11, on the subject of Israel. It's more than Israel's redemption that he's seeing. He's seeing the genius of God, of the reciprocity. Am I getting too fancy here? You know what it means? What reciprocal means? The relationship between one thing and another, by which neither the one nor the other can come to its fulfillment independent of the other. Something like marriage. We're married to Israel. We wouldn't have chosen her. What a stubborn, stiff-necked people who will kill us, oppose us, as they did historically, the worst persecutors of the apostolic church. After having stoned the prophets and slain its own Messiah, then went ahead and persecuted Paul and the apostolic church. And will again at the end. Because by every reckoning, the threat to them, Paul and the apostolic church. And will again at the end. Because by every reckoning, the threat to them seems to be coming from Christians and the church. They're the ones who were instrumental in removing prayer from the public schools. They're the ones who are instrumental in removing the Christmas creche. Is that how you say it? In communities that would put up their little Christmas exhibit. Jews are instinctively opposed to any celebration of Christianity because the one thing that they dread is that it would become a state religion. Where then would they be in such a fix? See what I mean? So they want to make sure that America remains relativistic and open to many faiths, including Judaism, so that they would not be exempted and stand out as the one people who are not going along with the fundamentalists at the Christian right. They foam at the mouth over this. It's ironic to say, but that the the American Civil Liberties Union is essentially a Jewish organization. And who is it who defended the right of Nazis to parade through the streets of Skokie, Illinois, and have their Nazi demonstration? The American Civil Liberties Union. protecting the rights of every minority because they themselves are a minority. And so what are they gaining by removing prayer from the public schools and secularizing America and removing the benevolent influence that somehow used to exist as a residue in our American civilization, the absence of which now has bred a generation of kids that will kill each other in schools without blinking an eyelash and will eventually kill them. See what I mean? That in their self-interest and in the particular defensive mode that they must perform in their secular mindedness, they're acting against the very things that would have been to their benefit. And that has always been our history. Who is it who encouraged a movement away from Orthodox Christianity in Germany to a more of a nature religion, God revealed in nature rather than in Christ? And that the orthodoxy is stultifying to have a religion predicated on creed, that we need a religion that is more accessible and conducive to feeling. And so in the Germany of the mid or early 18th century, a young star was rising by the name of Schleiermacher, who became the father of German theology. If Jim were here, he would be amening me all the way. Who was the chaplain of the Prussian army and became the most formidable influence in German Christianity to move it from a biblical, apostolic, and orthodox understanding into the kind of liberal thing that finally eventuated in the God is Dead movement. Who suffered for that? What came into the vacuum of German culture and civilization when the vitality of an orthodox and apostolic Christianity was lost? Nazism, demonism, that destroyed those who were instrumental in affecting the loss of orthodox or authentic Christianity in Germany, namely the Jew. Because the ones who recognized Schleiermacher and his gifts were Jewish patrons of the arts. Even the descendants of Mendelssohn, his granddaughters, patronized or helped this young theologian to get started and to become the influence that he became. Jews have cut their noses despite their faces. We've created the Frankenstein that destroys us. And that same phenomenon is working now and will to the end. They'll oppose us, thinking that we represent a threat to them. We are fundamentalist Christians. We're seeking their conversion. We're opposed to them remaining as Jews. That's my mother's great struggle. When who is more dedicated to the Jewish people, willing to suffer even on their behalf, than fundamentalist Christians, evangelical Christians? Okay, well, these are not little side issues. They're central issues, and maybe evidently has pleased the Lord, even before we get into this text, to touch some of these things that are evidently new to a number of you. So, God's mistreatment of the Jew, the coming Holocaust of the time of Jacob's trouble, will raise for the shallow Christian the question of, where is God? We've not yet successfully answered the question for the last Holocaust. How will we answer it for the next? By every appearance it will seem, if there is a God, He's not just, He's not righteous, He's not kind, He's not merciful. To allow this people again, a second time within the same century, to pass through such a trial unto death, and He will not alleviate it short of death. It's not just a light reprimand, because one of my major differences with the brothers in Israel who say, yes, there's a time of Jacob's trouble coming on. We don't dispute that. There will be a trouble, but it's not as severe as you say. They'll survive. The nation will survive. Because didn't God say that so long as the sun gives its light and the moon and the stars, that my covenant with Israel will stand and that there will always be a nation before me? Yes, that's true. But we have to distinguish between a nation and a state. God is not under obligation to preserve the state, but He's under obligation to preserve the nation. Got the picture? Here's the point that went among the many points. This will tax our understanding of God severely, to understand that God in judgment and severe chastisement is still God. And that in fact His judgments and His chastisements are not contrary to his nature, but the deepest revelation of his nature. That it's not opposite to kindness, it is kindness. Only those of us who can't chastise our own children will be offended by his chastisements. But those of us who are sons who have received his chastisements will understand exactly what he's doing with the nation and not be offended. Blessed are all they who are not offended in me. Not that the blessing is the reward of not being offended, but it's because you're blessed that you're not offended. You're blessed because you know God in a way that recognizes that his judgments are his mercy. You're not offended by his judgments. You love his judgments because when his judgments are in the world will learn righteousness. The issue of Israel is the severest test for the Christian in the last days. It's God's very provision for us, calculated to save us from a shallowness about the knowledge of God, his purpose and his will, that nothing else could have obtained. So that Israel, even in her unbelief, and especially in her unbelief, is God's very provision for the church. Can you see that? Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and the knowledge of God. Who has been his counselor? Paul was seeing it. That Israel is for the church's sake. Doesn't he say that? They are the enemies of the gospel for your sake. Who needs enemies like that? These are ultimate enemies. They are supreme enemies. They're not some amateur Ku Klux Klaner spitting out some little stupidity. They are learned, erudite, sophisticated, well-spoken. Man, they'll intimidate you. And you're going to witness to them. They'll chew you up and spit you out in a better knowledge that you yourself have. And they'll do it with a better grammar than that which you are capable. Jews are the most foreboding opposition to the gospel in its entire history. And they were calculated for that, for our sake. Who needs it? We need it. Or else we would have been a bunch of mamby-pambies, just going along superficially and taking the drunk out of the street and telling him he needs to be saved. Who can't do that? But let's see you take a man with a master's degree and a PhD and who has never once ever barked at his wife. He's much more the exemplary husband than you have ever been as a spirit-filled man. And tell him that he needs your Christ. And when you'll do that, you will have come to the faith. It's the supreme test. Because everything in appearances is contrary. This doesn't look like, he doesn't look like he's lost. He's going to need your Christ, in whose name his people have been historically persecuted. Man, he's got it all together. He's accomplished. He's well-spoken. He's humane. He belongs to B'nai B'rith. He's received the Man of the Year award. And you're telling him that he's lost because he doesn't have your Christ? Hey, that's Christofascism. That's an absolutist mentality. That's dogmatism. What's the matter with his Judaism? Can you tell him what's wrong with it? See what I mean? The issue of the Jew is the issue of the church. Dum, 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 dum. It's not one that we would have chosen, but God in his wisdom has chosen it. We are locked in to a reciprocal relationship with his people, without which we would never have come forth into sonship and into prophetic stature, by which they themselves will be saved. Because when they become dry bones, who's going to speak to those bones? The Lord won't. Only the Son of Man. That's us. And if our speaking is just a little pipsqueak, hope against hope that it works, and is not a real prophetic faith, and is not carrying the resonance of God and the authority of God, those bones will remain bones. And Paul will still wait for the fulfillment of what shall their return be but life from the dead. The nations will still be dead, still be steeped in violence and fornication and incest and insanity and polluted and corrupted beyond all speaking, waiting for that nation. Because that nation, redeemed and restored out of death, is God's sole and exclusive answer to the nations. So those ministries that think that they're going to save nations are all wet. They're not calculated to save nations, but a people from the nations for his name, not the nations themselves. That's Israel's calling. Got the picture? This is a vast strategy of God. Israel is the key to the nations, redeemed. But who's the key to Israel? Dum, 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 dum. Shabby, sentimental Christians who are praying for the peace of Jerusalem, wanting conflict to pass and thinking that that's peace. The absence of conflict is not what God calls shalom.
Amen.
It's our convenience that we're really seeking, not the deep resolution of God that will glorify Him. And the church that does not have God's glory at the apex and the center of what it is about is not the church. It's an institution serving its own ends and promoting its own programs. And the Jews will be totally unaffected by them. And they will be eternally embarrassed for their failure. Who's going to address those bones? With prophetic speaking, whose word is itself a resurrection phenomenon and alone calculated to raise the dead. And has to be spoken with one voice. God's not looking for some virtuoso, and that if He has that one man, that's it. It's the church in its corporateness. It's the Son of Man as a company, speaking with one voice at one time when they are commanded and not when it's convenient. How do we come to that? Through suffering. How did any prophet ever come to it? We learned about Jeremiah. My God, that man was tempered in the fire and thrown into the pit. He suffered rejection. He questioned himself as to whether he himself was missing it. And how come he had to bear those burdens? I mean, that guy was shredded, sifted, dealt with, as were all the prophets, because they're not plucked out of the air. They come as the Son of God Himself to obedience through suffering. A stature in God, because it's in the fellowship of His suffering that He's revealed. The church that will save Israel is this kind of church. But it's not something that will be imposed upon it as a requirement. Will not be drafted where we have no alternative. God waits for the voluntary submission, as many as will. And when I finish messages like this, I give an invitation. How many will say to the Lord, Lord, whatever it takes for me to come in and be part of that last day's company of the sons of God who can speak the word of life to a dead Israel, I'm willing. From this time on, Lord, go ahead. Whatever it takes. I know it's going to take much. I'm soft. I'm sentimental. I'm self-serving. I'm weak. I'm vain. I'm proud. I'm egotistical. I'm cowardly. But whatever it takes to deal with all those things, that when you shall command it, I'll be in that company to speak the word that is the word. And it's going to take. But He waits to be voluntarily invited to perform that sanctifying work. Okay. It was beyond Ezekiel himself, beyond his prophetic faith and ability. It was an ultimate requirement that in Ezekiel's meeting of it, by the grace of God, he himself transcended himself and was brought into the ultimacy of God's intention for himself as a Son of Man. Can you see that? The crisis of a dead Israel compelled the prophet to a ground that he would not otherwise have found nor even have sought. And that's why chapter 37 has as much to do with the Son of Man as with Israel. Because they represent God's two cardinal concerns. Israel as a nation and the Son of Man as the church. And neither one comes into its fulfillment independent of the other. We would be satisfied with the measure of growth or progress we've obtained, but it's not God's measure. Israel will require the ultimate measure because Israel will constitute the ultimate crisis. So the famine took place throughout that country. Others suffered. Isn't that interesting? Just like the famine that came to Elijah. It shall not rain nor dew, but according to my word. Hotshot making a pronouncement, speaking for God as God. And God honored it. For 3 years there was no rain nor dew. Animals were bellowing because their grass was dried up and they had no stream from which to drink. The whole of Israel's economy was pulverized and devastated because a single man pronounced the judgment. It shall not rain nor dew, but according to my word. And he himself was not exempt from the very conditions brought by his word. He had to be fed by a raven. He himself would have perished. And the very stream by which he abided dried up. So the prophetic man is not exempt from the conditions. He suffers them with others. But that God is allowing and will allow widespread suffering in the fulfillment of His redemptive purposes is something that will boggle our minds and give the impression that He's unjust. One of the great cries from the Jewish community that argues against the Holocaust as being the judgment of God is, but it couldn't be, Art, because of the 6 million victims, 1.5 million were children. Are you trying to say that God would take the lives of innocent children in that cruel death that the concentration camp was? We may understand it for adults, but children? That couldn't be God, because it's a contradiction. God is just. God is loving. God is merciful. How would He allow the innocent to suffer together with the guilty? Can you answer that question? Have you thought about that question? Have you broken your brains over that question? The book is there on the rack of that question and an answer, because I've broken my brains over it. And it's remarkable to say that it's in that paradox and that contradiction that not only do you find an explanation for God, but the deepest revelation of God. That where it seems to contradict God is the ground in which the revelation will come if you press through to the deepest understanding of God. It's where He seems to be the most offensive that He reveals Himself in His greatest mercy. It's full of contradiction. But why are we fixed at so shallow a level that we don't know Him as we ought? We have cliched notions about God, which are more the projection of our own imagining than the truth of Him. Because we've not wrestled through, because we've not agonized with these paradoxical questions out of our own history. We've swept it under the carpet and have gone on. The thing intended for our understanding and our growth has been dismissed and swept away because we were unwilling to look into the burning bush. We passed it by. It gave us a chill. It was a strange phenomenon. It burned and was not consumed. Hey, I better not even look into this. If I look into this, I'm fearful about what the effect or consequence for me will be. But when God saw a man who did not turn away, but looked in, not only just out of curiosity, but to ask the question why it burned without being consumed, then God said, Moses, Moses, the ground on which you stand is holy. This is the ground of your call and your consecration to be Israel's very deliverer, because you've not turned away from the fire. You've looked into the midst of that bush and the issue of judgment. And that's where I am, in a depth of revelation of myself that is not to be given in any other place or in any other way. We have shallow notions of God because we have not looked into the burning bush, because we have not had a stomach to consider God's judgments, because we thought that a famine was an accident or an earthquake was a natural convulsion. We've not understood the complete sovereignty of God that is most tested, especially when it brings suffering. Inga's great dilemma about God is, how could God allow His Son to die on the cross? It boggles her mind. It's too cruel. How could God allow such cruelty on His own flesh? Because this is a woman that when her children had to be inoculated for the various things that they do when they go to school, turned purple in her face, that a needle was going to touch the flesh of her children and pain them, even momentarily. She's so averse to the suffering of the flesh. Is that the idea? And yet suffering is the deepest revelation of God. And what Jesus suffered on the cross, talk about suffering, was the greatest revelation of God. In His righteousness and in His mercy. In His condemnation of sin, in His statement about the human condition, and His answer to it. It's all in the burning bush that the cross itself is. But we've turned away and sentimentalized it. And Germany's undoing came through the influence of men like the poet Goethe, Goethe, who was a great humanist, poet, philosopher, but not a great Christian. And for him, the cross was an offense. It was too crude. And he said, what we need to do is garland the cross with roses, soften it. And in fact, he did it. And the whole nation paid the price. That's why I love these scholars. It was not just an intellectual operation. Their guts were involved. I'm looking now at the 3 volumes that is the greatest statement on the theocratic kingdom ever written by a man who suffered rejection from his own Lutheran church because he was occupied with eschatological questions of the last days which chilled them. George Peters, whose eyesight was so bad because of a childhood accident that it would uttermost pain to read and to write. And the man would spend 18 to 20 hours a day in study and then spend the entire night in writing to produce 3 volumes called The Theocratic Kingdom. That is the absolute classic on the great question of Israel, covenant, and kingdom. But it was a suffering to write it, and he had to suffer the rejection of men in his identification with these issues. I'll read you a little bit of his biography if you're interested. Suffering on the cross is the name of the game. So our false notions of God, our hope for desires for Israel are all a statement of our distance from that cross and our shrinking from it. Wanting an easy fix, a quick fix, rather than God's ultimate and enduring redemption. So here's a father who allowed his son to go out into the world and to misspend his entire heritage. What a picture of Israel, the Jews historically. And this is the father that when the son comes back through the famine, and he says, I'm better off being a servant in my father's house. I don't deserve to be a son. At least I'll have bread. I'll not have to eat what I'm feeding the pigs. That the father saw him coming and ran to greet him and embrace him. Well, if he had that kind of love for the son that saw him from afar off and went running to greet him, why didn't he express that love earlier? Why didn't he save the son out of his distress? Why didn't he send him a care package? What kind of a father is that? To allow his own son to come to the brink of starvation that he might come to himself? I'll tell you what kind of father that is. That's a true father. That's the everlasting father. That's the father that God himself is, and the father that none of us ever had, or we would be different men. We had fathers who took it easy on us because they did not love us enough to discipline and to chastise us. It's not that they wanted to spare us pain, they wanted to spare themselves pain. This father is willing for the pain of being a father who knows that his son is dying by inches and is with the swine, but will not interrupt, but allow it to have its full redemptive working. For the son must come back to the father voluntarily and of himself and recognize, I have not only sinned against you, but I have sinned against God. And nothing short nor less than this famine and degradation of being reduced with the pigs would have accomplished it. There was no cheapy and quick fix. This is a great parable, but we've not come to the heart of it, which is not so much the response of the father, but the response of the elder brother. That's us. The profligate son who has misspent his inheritance is Israel and the Jew. What an inheritance they had, my God, from the beginning, but it's been misspent. And we're the older son who's been obedient, and we've worked hard, and we've been faithful, and he never made a feast for us. How come you made a feast for this bum who's misspent everything? So he heard the sound of singing and celebration, and he asked the servant, what's going on here? And the servant said, your father has killed the fatted calf in verse 27 because he has got him back safe and sound. Then he became angry. Interesting what will reveal the truth of one's condition. This was always true of him, but it took the return of the son and the father's gracious response to the son to reveal in the brother what would not otherwise have been seen. And I want to tell you of the opposition that I face as I travel the world and bring the message of the mystery of Israel, that the greatest opposition comes from Anglo-Saxons. More in England, or Australia, New Zealand, not so much, but England, than any other place. There's a resentment There's something deep in these Anglo-Saxons that resents that God has an intention for His Son, that maybe will exclude them or take some measure of their reward or their glory because they want it all for themselves. Because after all, they are now the Israel of God. And they are in the, what do they call it, movement? The restoration movement. They are the apostolic glory and prophetic. But their treatment of me is so shabby that it belies any truth about their claim to be either apostolic or prophetic. I don't want to tell you. I mean, it's rude the way I have been treated. That you wouldn't even expect such treatment from the world, let alone a movement that calls itself apostolic, because I bear a message they cannot bear to hear. It triggers an inmost resentment in them about the Jew. There's something in them, I don't know what it is about the British, because even the word Britain, some say, has come from the Hebrew word Brit, which means covenant, and that they see themselves as the dispersed of Israel that are the true Israel of God. This is British Israelitism. And that these Jews today are not the real thing. They're Khazar Jews. They're, cheapy addition. They are the ones who really have the destiny in God. And they resent this one coming back now who says, no, I'm the original son. And the Father has for me a ring and a cloak and a garment of the highest kind and honor and reward, though I'm totally undeserving. And there's nothing that's going to reveal the baseness of our hearts than when God gives to the undeserving the largesse and generosity and love and tribute that we think they do not qualify for and are entirely undeserving. And the thing that involuntarily rises up from us when we hear this is, but they don't deserve it. Well, that's true. But what did you deserve? What do you think? That your salvation was something given you because you deserved it? Evidently, there's something wrong in your understanding of the faith. You have really never ever come to the foundational ground of what this faith is and what this salvation is. Or your attitude about your brother would be far different than what you are exhibiting in your anger. You're angry. You have no generosity of soul. You have no magnanimity. You're not grateful that your brother has come back who was lost and was dead and is now alive. You'd rather see him dead. And if you had to speak to those bones, you would shut up. Even if God commanded you, you would not prophesy to them because you don't want to see Israel raised again to a place of prominence. You want to be the one that's prominent. That God's purposes should fail because of the base motivation of a church that seeks only its own glory and its own exaltation and has no place in its heart for its brother. That's the meaning of this parable. And the father has to plead with the son who refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him, but he answered his father very gruffly. Listen, for all these years I've been working like a slave for you, and I never disobeyed your command, yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, the way he describes him, this brother, no, this son of yours, he's unwilling to even identify with that one as being his brother. And Jesus says, what you do for the least of these, my brethren, is the issue of your eternal fate. Jesus is not ashamed to call a backslidden and apostate nation in judgment, being cast out in the nations again, his brethren. But when did we see you naked, thirsty, hungry, and in prison? As you have not done this for the least of these, my brethren, you have not done it unto me. Because I am thoroughly and totally identified with this scandalous people in all of their filthy condition and all of their judgment. They are still my brethren. Because my love is not predicated on the condition of anyone. Because I'm not responding to what they are, I'm expressing what I am. This is what I am in myself. And because you have not been that in yourself, you not only fail to recognize them, but you couldn't bring yourself to extend mercy to them. Because your salvation was never really a salvation. It was a shallow religious kind of thing where you spoke the right words and subscribed to the right credo, but you did not have the right reality. Because your very statement, they don't deserve it, shows that you have never surrendered to the grace of God. You've quoted it as a credo, it's in your doctrine, but it's not in your heart. And when you boast, what do you boast? I have always worked for you like a slave. What a statement is that? I never feel like I'm a slave and I'm working for the Lord like I'm a forced laborer. It's a privilege, my God. So his whole attitude, even about working for the Father, shows how far out of the faith he was. That's strange to say. There's more hope for this prodigal son who had wasted all his substance than this so-called faithful and loyal son who always obeyed his commandments. Yeah, but not out of love. And that the father has to say, but son, he said, all that I have has always been yours. I didn't think of you a goat. Everything that I have is yours. How come you didn't know that? If you knew that, you could afford to be generous to your brother who's now coming back. The fact that you're stingy and penny pinching and tight-fisted, that you won't even come in and celebrate, shows how little you know how gracious I have been to you, for all that I have is yours. That's why Jesus could take off his robe and take on the form of a servant and get a bowl of water and a towel and wash the stinking feet of his disciples. And they were shocked. Peter said, you better not do that to me. Oh yeah? If I don't do that to you, you have no part with me. How was he able, the Lord of glory, to take off the robe of his distinction and gird himself with a towel like a common servant and wash their filthy feet? And call that a benediction? Because he knew that he had come from the Father and that he was going to the Father and that the Father had given him all things. That knowledge will permit your humility. It's the key to it. It will permit your graciousness. It'll be an end to your tight-fisted measuring it out by teaspoons. You'll be able to be large because God has given you all things and you know it. It took this profligate son to reveal the truth of the condition of the older brother. That would never have been revealed in any other way. So God was allowing the famine not only for the one son, but equally for the other, because he's concerned for both the original son and the old son. He's concerned for Israel, he's concerned for the church. And it's only Israel's plight that has misused its substance and its inheritance that will reveal our heart. But they don't deserve it. That the Father should run to them and put a ring on their finger and the best garment and kill the fatted calf and have a celebration. Never did that for me. It's amazing what the heart of the church is. That never would have been seen, would have gone into eternity in that condition had not the revelation come in this life through God's allowing the other to come into a famine. Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and the knowledge of God. What a God is this? How far will he go? And how far is he required to go when it's not only the issues of this life that are at stake and at question, but the issues of eternity itself? And for in whatever condition we end this natural life, it's in that condition that our eternal destiny will be fulfilled. Some will rule over 5 cities and some over 10. Some will not even inherit the kingdom at all. So, Lord, clobber us and enable us vicariously to see ourselves in this text. Wow. What an eye-opener, Lord. And we have to ask, with which brother do I really have the deepest identification? Because there's more hope for the one than the other. And Lord, if I have that older brother's hardness and resentment and anger, who won't even come in to celebrate, I'm asking you to deal with my heart and open my understanding that you have always given me all things. I don't have to be stingy. There's room not only for the glory that shall be mine as the church, but there's room also for the glory that shall be Israel in her return. You're not going to run out. There's enough for everybody. And in that I can be gracious to the returning people. And in that grace, be an instrument for them of your own salvation. So Lord, instruct us deeply. Deal with us deeply. That's why we've come here. This is a special kind of a school. This is not just an academic thing. This is a dealing. And we've asked for it, and you're doing it. So go deep into our hearts, my God, and unmask it. Show us the depth of our hearts and what is the truth of our condition. Because only you can remedy that. Thank you for being such